Good evening, it's the VC Andrews Kritika. Look into my eyes so I can suck your blood. Sorry, I make a crappy vampire, but there's certainly been a lot of good ones in movie history, like the Countess from American Horror Story, Edward Cullen from Twilight, and of course, Dracula from, well, Dracula. But today we'll be looking at arguably the most famous vampire ever. From the 80s anyway. That, of course, being Jerry Dandridge from Fright Night. For those who haven't seen the movie, I think the best way to describe it is if Rear Window were a big-budget episode of Goosebumps. The plot revolves around a teen named Charlie Brewster, who sees his new neighbor Jerry acting like a vampire through his window, and concludes that he is a vampire and the one responsible for all the recent disappearances in his town. Of course, his mom and the cops don't believe him, but he is able to convince his two friends and an iconic horror actor, and they team up to try and find a way to thwart Jerry once and for all. But Jerry soon finds out they're onto him and is determined to defeat them first. It was nothing new or spectacular, but thanks to good acting, directing, and execution of the cliched premise, people responded rather well to the film and it made big money at the box office. So of course, a remake was inevitable. I think the best way to describe the remake is if the original movie were an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, incorporating more action scenes and making the characters more badass. And it also was quite well received, especially for Colin Farrell's performance as Jerry, and it managed to garner a fresh 72% on Rotten Tomatoes. But is it any match for the 80s cult classic? Well, that's what we'll be finding out today. And just remember that all of this is opinion based, and if you enjoy one movie better overall, then that's wonderful. So brace yourself with a crucifix and holy water as we take a look at old versus new Fright Night.
Fright Night!
It's a good thing that in addition to many famous vampires, we have a lot of great vampire killers as well, like Raina Cruz, Van Helsing, and of course, Buffy the Vampire Slayer herself. But since none of them were around, we'll have to settle for Herman from Herman's Head and Chevok from the Star Trek reboots. Interesting choices? This is best Charlie. In the role of Charlie Brewster, we have William Ragsdale in the original and Anton Yelchin in the remake, both with very different takes on the nerd who becomes the target of a vampire and has to use his quick wits to survive. Let's look at Ragsdale's portrayal first. The original Charlie is really just a straightforward nerd, without much of the badass fighter persona. He's got no tough one-liners, not very much charisma or aggression. He can be a decent fighter when the situation demands it, but sadly, there's not much of that here. So I think it goes without saying that this Charlie's not going down in any monster killer history books. But in spite of that, there is a lot of heart that's offered with this performance. Ragsdale just has this socially awkward charm to him that only a handful of nerds can successfully pull off. So a combination of that and his strong determination to protect his loved ones still makes you really want to support him throughout the movie. So we have a very simplistic guy that still manages to be extremely charming and likable. Okay, so how does Yelchin's portrayal compare? Well, again, it's very different, going into a lot more detail with the character's personality and background. The 2011 Charlie is a guy who's recently transitioned from an alien video making nerd into a cocky high school punk that wants absolutely nothing to do with his past dork life, to the point where he doesn't even care that one of his old nerd friends is missing, and he says to his other friend that his life is better without him. Yeah, he's a pretty big douchebag at first, but his smooth-talking smartass persona is still a lot of fun, and he does become kinder and more concerned about his loved ones throughout his experience of being stalked by a vampire, while still maintaining that charismatic punk persona. And I think it goes without saying that this makes him a much more memorable vampire slayer. That and also having a lot more time devoted to fighting vampires. But even with all that, Yelchin is still able to convey a natural nerdiness in the character throughout the movie that's small but still evident. He's the kind of guy where no matter how much moxie he gives off, he's still a nerd at the end of the day. AIM even addresses this at one point in the movie. And again, Ragsdale is still very likable and supportive, but there just seems to be a lot more with both writing and performing with Yelchin. He's the perfect blend of a socially awkward dork and a smartass monster killer, a lot like Ash from the Evil Dead movies, and besides growing as a fighter throughout the movie, he's also growing as a person. Ragsdale, you're great, but Yelchin's version is just stronger and more complex. Point goes to the new.
Filthy son of a bitch!
And now for the vampire himself, who proved that you actually can take a vampire named Jerry seriously. Very seriously, in fact. But let's see which one's bite is sharper with Best Jerry. Let me start off by saying that Jerry Dandridge is an awesome villain. He's smug, cocky, and over the top, making him a lot of fun, but he's also violent, intimidating, and sexually perverted, thus making him a legitimate threat. This is showcased quite well in both movies, but there are definitely some key differences. Chris Sarandon in the original portrays Jerry as very calculating and manipulative. He's able to come off as a completely genuine and respectable guy that no one would ever suspect of foul play, while also carefully strategizing the place and time he attacks his victims to avoid drawing attention to himself. Colin Farrell doesn't seem as concerned about avoiding suspicion. You can always feel his lust and callousness when he's trying to act natural around others, and half the time, he doesn't even bother with it and just openly attacks even when it's in plain sight. Take for example how he gets past the whole vampires can't go into someone's house without an invitation rule in both movies. In the original, he charms Charlie's mother into inviting him over for a drink and says in a casual manner that he'll be dropping by often with her permission, to which Mrs. Brewster says, "Oh yeah, of course." Genius! You can also see him carefully planning out his attack when he breaks into the house, making sure Mrs. Brewster's asleep, locking her door, and sneaking into the closet to wait for Charlie to come. In the remake, Jerry asks to come inside, and when Mrs. Brewster says no, he immediately just goes and burns the house down.
Don't need an invitation if there's no house.
Chris Sarandon starts attacking on the spot too, but it's closer to the end of the movie when his sanity starts slipping from his determination to kill Charlie. Farrell loses what little patience he had with waiting to attack very early on and goes 100% feral, pun intended. But I digress. Which of these two is the more effective villain? Well, as enjoyable as Farrell's completely psychotic performance is, you can't be this obvious and careless about attacking people and not expect to draw attention to yourself. Unless the police are idiots, like they are in this case. Sarandon had very strategized and sneaky ways of attacking, which made him more unpredictable and thus more dangerous. And he could be a crazy psychopath too, he just did it when he was behind closed doors with his victims. That, and he seems to have a wider range of superpowers. Farrell just seems to have superhuman strength, but Sarandon has that and also mind control, bat morphing, and teleporting powers, making him a more versatile predator. Tough call, but I am going to go with the original. He was just more clever and powerful, and thus was a more dangerous threat to our characters. Point goes to the old.
I thought you did your homework.
Fright Night!
But you can't fight vampires without some good supportive backup. So let's see which one we'd rather have our backs with. Best Supporting Cast. I guess we should start with Charlie's girlfriend briefly turned vampire Amy, played in the original by Amanda Bierce and in the remake by Imogen Poots. Is that name a tragedy or what? But anyway, let me start off by saying that both are pretty good vampires, sufficiently menacing but not without a bit of humor. But as to which one is better as a human, I'm going to go with the 2011 one, because she just seems like the best girlfriend a guy could ask for. She's chill, sarcastic, fun-loving, and likes to playfully mess with Charlie, but she really does love him for the nerd he is inside instead of the punk he tries to be in public. The original Amy is not as awesome of a girlfriend. I mean, she's nice overall and can be supportive of Charlie when she wants to be, but she's also kind of a downer, often getting stressed or pissed about something whenever she's on screen. And when danger comes along, all she really does is panic and gets caught by Jerry pretty quickly. The new Amy gets a fair amount of badass moments in the movie where she helps Charlie fight Jerry off. Sure, she eventually becomes a damsel in distress too, but not without putting up a good fight first. Charlie's mother gets a similar treatment here. The original mother is caring, but also a bit airheaded and not in very much of the movie. The one in the remake has a lovable smartass persona similar to her son's, and does a little more, even getting a scene where she impales Jerry. And faints from shock immediately afterwards, somewhat sucking the awesomeness out of it, but still. And yeah, let's talk about Evil Ed, Charlie's quote-unquote best friend turned vampire. This is probably the biggest difference both versions have. It's interesting how the original has much more of him as a human than a vampire, while the remake has a lot more of him as a vampire than a human. But this is also kind of a con. How so? Well, in the original, Evil Ed's character mainly exists to provide some exposition on vampire killing and some comic relief for the movie. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the problem is, he's at his funniest when he's a vampire. Yeah, this may be the most hilariously over-the-top performance I have ever seen in film history.
Oh, well, apparently, she's working nights. But she left a note. Here's dinner's in the oven.
But again, he's only a vampire for a relatively small part of the movie, and as a human, his trolling comes off more as annoying than funny. I mean, I got a couple good laughs from it, but he's just such an obnoxious douchebag to Charlie and Amy for so much of the film, I kind of wonder why they even hang out with him. Ed in the remake is more of the traditional movie nerd, but they actually gave him a much better backstory. Here, it's initially Ed who's trying to thwart Jerry with his strong knowledge of vampires, before he almost immediately gets thwarted and Charlie has to take his place. The remake also explains why he picks on his best friend so much. Like said before, Charlie's constantly been blowing Ed off to be with Amy and the cool kids, to the point where Ed has to blackmail Charlie into helping him look for their missing friend Adam. So it's strongly implied that the way he acts is out of bitterness towards his best friend not wanting to be his best friend anymore. Or maybe even more. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, both movies imply that Ed is gay for Charlie, making it more understandable why Ed's jealous of Amy in this version. The original only slightly so, but the remake is not so subtle, especially when Ed becomes a vampire.
Girls made you lazy in the head. Pussy'll do that. Is this weird for you? Because I'm feeling really homo right about now.
Ed's other non-gay vampire moments have the same type of humor that's still effectively funny, but doesn't hold a candle to the original. But I am still going to go with the new version because I just found the character more complex and sympathetic. Plus, his conflict with Charlie seems very similar to the conflict of Will and Mike in Stranger Things Season 3, and being a huge Stranger Things fan, that seems point-worthy to me. There's also a few additional characters in this version who don't have much screen time but serve important parts in the story, like the two jocks who play a part in turning Charlie against Ed, and Ed and Charlie's friend Adam, whose disappearance is pretty much what kicks off the plot. Jerry's partner in crime and possibly in love isn't in this version, but Peter Vincent gets an assistant with a few good laughs. So this round is going to go to the remake because the support here seems more supportive towards Charlie and more involved with the plot. Point goes to the new.
I don't understand you.
But brains are just as important as brawn for going against the supernatural, so let's look at the one who helps guide Charlie on his quest for battling the undead, the best Peter Vincent. The hero's mentor Peter Vincent is played by Roddy McDowall and David Tennant. Like a lot of components in this comparison, the basic idea of the character is the same, but the execution couldn't be any more different. Let's look at the original first. Roddy McDowall is a timid and feeble middle-aged man who's nothing like the badass vampire killer he plays in movies, and isn't too psyched when he has to become what he is on camera for real. He starts out as a bit of a prick towards Charlie because his already struggling film career has just had the kiss of death with the cancellation of his show Fright Night, and right when he's on the verge of eviction. So naturally, he isn't too concerned about a supposedly insane kid who claims a vampire is after him. But as he bonds with Charlie and realizes the kid's not bluffing about the stakes here, he shows that he really can be a very sweet and caring guy that's willing to go to dangerous lengths to help his friend, even if he is a total pansy while doing so. David Tennant's version is the exact opposite in almost every way. This guy's a televised stage magician with a vampire theme for his show instead of a guy who just hosts a TV show that plays his old movies, so naturally his career is doing a tad better. What with him living in a fancy penthouse in Vegas with a smoking hot assistant and lover. Also, where McDowell is a formal and timid Englishman, Tennant is an egotistical, foul-mouthed hotshot whose initially cold treatment of Charlie is more of the usual celebrity jerkism. But with that said, his cocky wise guy attitude is still pretty funny, a lot like Yelchin's Charlie, and he does have a soft spot deep down, it's just not quite as strong as McDowell's. But the biggest difference of all is probably the character's connection to vampires, where in the original, Peter didn't believe in vampires at all until he met Charlie. This Peter knows they exist, his parents having been killed by one when he was a child. He reveals this is why he collects so many vampire-repelling artifacts and has a vampire killer motif for his show. And this is probably why he seems a lot more skilled and prepared when going against the undead. The only problem is that I don't think giving him this backstory works very well in the character's favor. It's certainly a unique spin on the original, but part of what made the original Peter Vincent's character so interesting was how he had to learn to become what Hollywood made him out to be in the span of just 12 hours at best. By having him already know that vampires are real and giving him past experience with dealing with them, it kind of takes away from the becoming the mask aspect of the story, and also unintentionally makes Peter less sympathetic. Yeah, I know the idea here is that they made Peter more of a jerk in this version, but having him already know that vampires are real really makes him look bad when he refuses to help Charlie at the beginning, or when Amy is kidnapped near the end. The original had the excuse that Charlie just sounded like a lunatic babbling about vampires when he had the problem of eviction to worry about, and you probably wouldn't be too on board right away to help someone rescue a loved one from a vampire when you just learned that they exist. Here, Peter just looks like a cowardly douchebag for his hesitancy to help Charlie when he's known about the danger of vampires for so many years. Yeah, he does eventually nut up and help Charlie like in the original, but even then, his bond with Charlie never feels quite as strong. I mean, it's clearly there, but it feels more like a brief partnership to deal with the threat of fanged abominations rather than a genuine friendship. This may be because Tennant doesn't have quite as much screen time as McDowell, not allowing as much time for him to form a true connection with Yelchin. But either way, McDowell's chemistry with Ragsdale in the original felt a lot more sincere, where you can really see how much each one cares about the other and has their back at any cost. Sure, Peter never quite becomes a father figure to Charlie, but they've clearly become good friends who will meet again for an inferior sequel. While each take on the character has its own unique charm, Roddy McDowell's just makes the character a bit more interesting and likable. Point goes to the old.
Get the fuck out of my house.
Fright Night! Who's it gonna be tonight?
It's all tied up, so let's discover which vampire fight comes out more victorious with Best Story. This is Story for the Win. Like said before, the basic story itself is nothing new. We've seen the whole kid finds a monster in their neighborhood and no one believes them premise in film too many times to count, but with good execution it can still make an enjoyable horror movie, and thankfully both films have just that. Question is, which one has the better execution? Let's look at the remake first. A major reason for why the best Charlie and supporting cast went to this version was because it has a good amount of time at the beginning to introduce us to the characters' personalities and relationships with one another, and sets up character arcs for some of them to go through in the story, for better or for worse. The original jumps right into the main conflict at the very beginning of the movie with only some small character exposition on the side. This doesn't work well in the long run, with Charlie coming off as a bit bland, and Amy and Ed coming off as too unpleasant and without enough depth or redeeming qualities. And it also raises some questions for later in the story. Take for instance when Jerry manipulates Ed into letting him bite him by assuring him it'll solve his unhappiness with being different. This never really feels all that warranted in the original, because while there is an implication that Ed is gay, it's never strongly suggested that he feels like an outcast because of it, or even has any real depression at all. Because the remake makes Ed's gayness for Charlie more obvious, as well as the fact that Charlie just said right to Ed's face that his life got better when he stopped being friends with him, it's more understandable why he'd be driven to do something so drastic. Speaking of which, there's also the question of why Jerry turns Amy and Ed into vampires in the original. In the remake, it's revealed that Jerry's motivation is to create an army of vampires to take over the world, so that makes sense. But in the '85 film, Jerry's motive just seems to be to murder for a kick, so what makes Ed and Amy special? Sometimes less is more, but in this case, less is just more confusing. I also like how the story has an action film vibe as well as a horror film one. There were definitely some decent fight scenes in the original, but they felt a little too much like self-defense, and the main characters never seemed quite as badass during them. The fight scenes in the remake felt like something out of The Walking Dead, and setting the story in Las Vegas allowed for some pretty great locations for these fights to take place. But for all the things the remake improved, there are definitely some drawbacks, like with the pacing. This isn't a critical issue, but sometimes the transitions feel a bit choppy, and certain scenes feel too rushed to leave a strong enough impact. The pacing in the original always felt very consistent, with each scene falling smoothly into the next one and lasting just the right amount of time to give us a good laugh or scream. There's also a lot more suspense and mystery in the original, like whether or not Jerry's sidekick Billy is human. You would think you could see the answer as clear as day, but the film actually makes it pretty hard to guess, especially since we see him come out in the daytime and thus we know that he's not a vampire. Even the twists you can easily see coming still have a lot of tension to them. Like, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to guess that the holy water Peter has him drink to prove to Charlie that he's not a vampire isn't going to affect him. But there's still several things you start wondering, like did he switch the water out when no one was looking? Is he part human at times and thus immune to it? Is Peter secretly involved with Jerry's plan and gave him ordinary water instead? The tension is terrible. The remake's definitely scary, but there's no big surprises or unexpected turns, except maybe for the secret past that Peter Vincent has with vampires, but like said before, that was one example of how adding more depth didn't work well in the character's favor. The last thing I want to talk about is the climax. The one in the remake is fine and has some good action scenes, but it's pretty short and to the point, so none of the things that Peter and Charlie encounter, like the vampire extras, the vampire Amy, or even the big bad Jerry himself, can really give us as epic of a final battle as they were building up. The climax of the original felt like a Sly Cooper game level, with several boss encounters, a segment where the main character gets overpowered and the side character has to rescue them, many different locations they have to move through, and even has the final boss fought in different stages, with more upgrades and backup brought in to protect themselves. It was one of the most epic climaxes I've ever seen in a movie. So, based on what I've shared so far, it's probably hard for you guys to tell which story I like better, and there's actually a good reason for that. I don't have one. Kind of like Doug Walker's review of the two Cinderella movies, I just feel the plots of both Fright Night movies have pros and cons, and neither one tells the story better or worse. I'm sure a lot of you disagree and have one that you like more than the other, but for me, the story's a tie. Point goes to both, which also means the match ends in a tie.
The more the better.
Kinda makes it hotter.